Hello and welcome. Only a handful of people can boast having walked on the moon, but the talents of this veteran astronaut go further as he helped to shape the way that space travel was developed in its early years. He even gave his name to a cartoon animated space commander. This week on One on One, meet veteran astronaut and fighter pilot Buzz Aldrin. Born Edwin Eugene Aldrin, he got the name Buzz as a toddler when his sister mispronounced brother as Buzzer. Aldrin honed his skills as a fighter pilot, but became a household name when the Apollo 11 mission made history with the first landing on the moon in 1969. Setting foot on the lunar surface, he provided the world with some of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Returning to Earth, he kept his feet firmly on the ground, despite receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and later lending his name to an animated hero, Buzz Lightyear, who in turn became a popular children's toy. Aldrin's cinematic connection was renewed in 2007 as he featured in an acclaimed documentary, Shadow of the Moon, alongside other survivors of the lunar missions. He still pursues an interest in rocket development, aiming to make space tourism a reality. Dr. Buzz Aldrin, great to have a chance to chat with you.
Nice to be here. Talk to you.
You're an American icon. When people think space, they think Buzz Aldrin. And I wonder, I know it's still very much a part of your life. You're still very involved in trying to get new projects going. When you look at the state of, the interest that countries like the US have in space exploration, it seems to have been put on the back burner compared with those heady days of the 60s and the 70s even, I guess. I mean, what's your take on where the space industry is going?
Well, when Sputnik goes up, it's a very, very unusual event. When Yuri Gagarin flies in space, it's a very unusual event. So there's a great public interest. And there was a great public interest in our country, and our president decided to use that interest to help motivate the American people to advance technology in space-related activities like launch and satellite control. So that's why he gave his commitment to put people on the moon and back. So during a pioneering period, many, many things are new. We had a transition from the Apollo program into the space shuttle, and that took a lot longer than we thought it would, and it's not really lived up to its expectations. And all the other time, other nations are beginning to do things. The Russians started taking guests up in space in their Soyuz. And clearly that was to let their people in Russia know that they're very welcome, that the Soviet Union was a very open society, so they took other people up for rides. And we did the same thing with the space shuttle. But it took us almost 6 years since we did a joint mission with the Russians, Apollo-Soyuz, before the first shuttle flew. And it's a little incongruous with a nation that once we got the Apollo program going, we landed 6 out of 6 times successfully, and then we had to wait and sit on the ground. So when you plan for transition between one major program and the next, you can expect to have a delay, and that's what we're going to be facing when we transition from the era of the space shuttle and the space station back into exploration. People have a fascination with people going somewhere, and in the Mercury and the Gemini program, people were beginning to prepare to go somewhere, and then Apollo, we did go somewhere. When we just go around in Earth orbit with the space station, that took much longer than we thought it would going to, cost a whole lot more, and the shuttle has not been as safe as we thought it would be. So certainly there's going to be a lack of interest when they don't see the direct participation of human beings.
Now, looking back to that time, and I was a little kid in the UK watching the lunar landing. Everyone was glued, the planet was glued to the box, watching what was happening.
Because it was new and it was pioneering. If we're not new and pioneering, the people are not that interested.
I wonder, when you think that nearly 4 decades have passed since then, would you have expected, looking back at the time, were you expecting by now we would be looking at landing on Mars, doing anything as grand as that?
Well, back in those days, we did some studies as to what programs would be like in the future. And there was a slow, a medium, and a fast program. And it was somewhat measured by how soon we would be able to send people to Mars. And the fast program would have been sometime in the mid to late 80s. And the slow program, we certainly would have gotten to Mars by the year 2000. So that was the expectation. Now, certainly when we aren't able to live up to that, people are a little disappointed that it hasn't gone the way we thought. But I think back in those days, we were a little naive. We're a little bit more aware of what it takes to have the public behind you, how much it costs to put rockets in space, and it's a lot more expensive than we thought it would be.
Let's take you back to the 1930s. You were born in Jersey, living in New Jersey as a boy. Take me back to that time. Of course, you know, the idea of space exploration was way out then, I guess. Take me through what happened through your childhood, the kind of interest you had that drew you to this.
Well, my father was an early pioneer. He learned to fly right at the end of World War I. And one of his early assignments was to be in the Philippines. That's where he met my mother, who was the daughter of an Army chaplain. Now, my father's assignment over in the Philippines was as an aide to the person who later became a general, Billy Mitchell. And he was obviously a very early pioneer in the growing air service that we had in those days. And my father knew lots of the people who were in those early ones. He got his doctor's degree from MIT in the early 20s and then became the commandant of the Air Force Engineering School, the Air Corps Engineering School near Dayton, Ohio. So I grew up with this pioneering family that knew lots of people in aviation, and I had my first airplane ride in a Lockheed Vega that was painted to look like an eagle.
And you were only 2 years old.
And I was a couple of years old.
And your father, Edwin, was the pilot for that.
Yes.
I gather you were airsick at the age of 2.
Yeah, well, that's what people tell me. I don't have vivid memories of that.
Now, in terms of your mother, Marion, how did your mother, Marion, shape your character? I think, what sort of influence did she have on you?
Well, she was around most all of the time, whereas my father was off on travel, so Dad was an inspiration in his career and his education steps, and that inspired me. His career field was in aviation, and during World War II, as I was a teenager growing up, it appeared as though the military was a good place to learn to fly. There wasn't any kind of an Air Force academy. The Air Force wasn't really a separate service. So I elected to go to West Point for my college training, and while I was at West Point, the U.S. became involved in the Korean War. And so upon graduation, I went through pilot training and got my wings, and then in gunnery training in Las Vegas, I was sent from there over to Korea for what turned out to be the last 6 months of the Korean War in 1953.
You flew 66 combat missions and took down a couple of MiGs
Yes,
during that time as well.
Yes.
So when you look at the jets of today, I mean, they seem to be so sophisticated, almost like computer run. How do you sort of relate to those? Do you feel that sort of the pilot's been taken out of the equation to some degree?
Well, the pilot is being taken out of the equation because the aircraft are capable of pulling more G's, acceleration, and they're capable of staying in the air and doing many very complex tasks. And we'd like not to have to risk the pilots, so we're moving somewhat more toward unmanned aircraft.
Of course, you went on in 1963, you were recruited by NASA onto the Gemini program, which you'd mentioned a bit earlier.
Well, I applied for NASA. I wasn't really recruited. The Air Force and the Navy and the Army made available possible applications. And when I knew my good friend Ed White, who had been on the track team with me, and we were in the same fighter squadron over in Germany, he rotated back a couple years before I did, and decided he was going to go to Michigan to get a master's degree. And then after doing that, he went through the test pilot training. So when it came into 1962, why Ed had been qualified by having been trained as a test pilot, and he wrote a letter to me, said, I'm going to volunteer for this space program. And I thought, well, if he's going to volunteer, I think I will too. I knew what the requirements were that you needed to have test pilot training, but I had elected not to go that path of career progression. So I applied for the second group, and Ed was selected, and I wasn't, and I understood why. But the next year they changed the requirements so that you didn't have to have the test pilot training. So there were several of us in that third group of astronauts, of 14 of us. There were a few who were not test pilot trained, and I was one of them.
But of course, once you got into NASA, things moved quickly. I'm going to get onto that in just a moment. We're going to pause for a break here, one-on-one with Buzz Aldrin. We'll be back in just a moment.